So, I want to think with you a little bit about Aldersgate, and I'm going to hold on to this guitar for just a little bit. Just have a prop in my hands. I'm going to wait and see if it feels right to play it. So, John Wesley, the founder of our, let's see if we got sound. We're turned on. We got it here. Well, it could be divine intervention. Maybe I wasn't meant to play. That's quite possible. I've got it plugged in here. Worked yesterday. You can hear me without it. I use Brad's guitar. Yeah. I use Brad's guitar. Oh, play the cello? Oh, sure, yeah. It's the same instrument. It's the same instrument. It's just two less strings and different tuning, but I could figure it out. Oh, I guess sound system just likes Brad guitar better than mine. I know, it's a temperamental thing. So John Wesley is the founder of our Methodist church, but this experience at Aldersgate is an interesting story. In the 1700s, John Wesley was an Anglican priest, but he had been sent to the U.S. to try to sort of create churches here at that period of time. So we hadn't even gone through the Revolution yet, but he was in Georgia. And just to abbreviate, he had a miserable experience here. He was probably just a failure. It was one of those, as ministers, we would often say, one of just the worst appointments we could possibly ever experience. And his ego was crushed. His sense of calling was crushed. On the trip back to England, on the ship he was with, it was a Moravian ship, and the Moravian church, which was started in Germany, was one in which he affiliated with in addition to the Anglican church because of some of their practices and some of their own sort of beliefs. And in this ship, he even marveled at how the Moravians seemed to have this comfort, just this ease with which they faced the storms of life, the very literal storms on the water. So that by the time he got back to England, as the story goes, he was absolutely disenchanted. His life was completely meaningless. He was depressed, and he saw no purpose to what he had spent most of his life doing at that point. And then he had one morning where he was reading a devotional, which had the text that he was reading in the Old Testament had basically said that we are all created to be partakers of God's creation, to be partakers of the divine. And that afternoon or that evening, he was invited to join some Moravians. And it was at this church that was on Aldersgate Street. It was a Moravian gathering. It was on Aldersgate Street in London. And they were reading the introduction to one of Luther's commentaries, Martin Luther, the Reformationist, and on the epistle to Rome, on Paul's epistle to Rome. And as the story goes, he says, "As I was listening to this, my heart was strangely warmed, and I suddenly had trust in Christ, that my life was saved, that Christ alone I am made whole," essentially. What I want to talk with you about is, for years and years and years, I have always heard that phrase sort of in the context of my own quote-unquote conversion experience. Now, I need to share with you, I've had many, because for a while I was a Baptist, and then I was Pentecostal, and I was Church of Christ for about a year and a half. And in every setting, it never felt like it was quite enough. If I'd been Catholic, I'm sure it would have been a whole new conversion experience. Some of you know exactly where I'm coming from. But what I want to suggest to you is this whole idea of trust is sometimes what we get hung up on when we think of Pentecost, when we think of Aldersgate, when we think of conversion, when we think of God, when we think of what it means to have faith in this time, in this world. So I just want to share a couple of thoughts. But to get there, I want to sing a song by Guy Clark, which I've sung years ago. It's been a while since I've sung this song. But this song to me speaks volumes. Well, he was 8 years old with a flour sack cape tied all around his neck. Stood up on the garage and he was figuring, what the heck? Screwed his courage up so tight, well, the whole thing came unwound. Got a running start and bless his little heart, he headed straight for the ground. 'Cause he's one of those who knows that life is just a leap of faith. Well, you hold your breath and you spread your arms and you always trust your cape. Now he's all grown up with the flour sack cape tied all around his dreams, full of piss and vinegar, and he's just busting at the seams. Stuck his finger up in the air, said it's gonna be do or die. He wasn't afraid of nothing and he figured that he could fly. He's one of those who knows that life is just a leap of faith. Gotta hold your breath and spread your arms, don't forget your cape. Now he's old and gray with that flour sack cape tied all around his head. And he's still jumping off of garages, probably will be till he's dead. All the folks around him telling him he's just acting like a kid. But he did not know he could not fly, so he did. 'Cause he's one of those who knows that life is just a leap of faith. You hold your breath and you spread your arms and you always trust your cape. Said he's one of those who knows that life is just a leap of faith. Hold your breath and spread your arms and you never forget your cape. Song has been sort of one of those guiding songs for me for years and years and years, and I used to sing it at camps when I worked at camps, like what Brad and I have been doing over the years at these camps for kids with cancer and such. And these wonderful sort of camps have these ropes courses, and maybe I've shared this in the past, where the challenge for a lot of folks is the last part of it, because at the very end of the ropes course, you're attached to cables, of course, and you've got people below you sort of encouraging along the whole way. But at the very end, you have to jump off of this pole, and you do a zip line for about 100 yards, and you're maybe 50, 60 feet off the ground. It's surprising to me how complicated and difficult a task that is for adults, for the counselors who seem to have it all together, who aren't suffering from traumatic illness, in many cases have never experienced that, and yet they can't let go. They can't step off. And for the kids who get up there and they're attached, and sometimes the counselor has to remind them, don't forget to stay attached. And they're ready to leap at the excitement, at the possibility. But after I started singing this song, on some of these camps, you go up to the top of that pole where the little platform is, and a lot of the kids will inscribe in there, don't forget your cape. And it sort of became a little bit of a motto and a kind of an anthem for so many of them. I think about what it is that enables us to trust in life, that enables us to move from day to day sometimes, when moving from day to day can be so challenging. I read this quote the other day. We experience moments absolutely free of worry. These brief respites are called panic attacks. So you may know that feeling. You may know that feeling of what it means to be so busy and so worried that even busyness and worry and anxiety sort of seems like the norm. So that when something really happens, it sort of breaks that norm of general anxiety. What keeps you up at night? What makes you anxious? Is it your health? Is it money? Is it job? Is it relationship? Is it the next phase of the journey? Not sure what the next step will be. When we find ourselves in these sort of unknown, unforeseen, mysterious, even desert-like places, I think we're somewhat where perhaps John Wesley was. If we look at his life and his sense of vocation, we've all been in that position, in that place. And I think that's kind of what is at the heart of this existential worry that Nicodemus expresses when he goes to Jesus. I've come to really love this story. I used to have a kind of a disdain for this story and for other kinds of texts, largely because of my own history growing up in these evangelical kind of churches that I grew up in my early years. I kind of steered away from these sort of concrete, emotionally based experiences, saying to myself that it really was superficial. It really wasn't deeply connected to a greater truth. It was so concrete, it didn't answer the mysteries of reality for me. And I just kind of rejected those things. But now I kind of come back to these stories and I see that there's such profound truth at the depths of some of these texts, and particularly John's gospel, because John's gospel is not like the other ones. John's gospel is this mysterious, mystical kind of text. So he portrays Jesus as standing here. Jesus, of course, is the one who's always fanning the flames of what's familiar, right? And turning them upside down, always challenging the conceptions that everyone has about how they are supposed to be related to God, what it means to be a part of God's kingdom. And he comes along and turns things upside down. Literally, right after meeting with Nicodemus in the gospel, the next story has Jesus going through Samaria to get back to Galilee. So he goes actually through an unclean country, a place of revulsion for Jews, and then engages a Samaritan woman in her narrative, even challenging her narrative, what she thinks of herself, challenging the Jewish narrative of what they think of her. Jesus was always fanning the flames. And so we have this story of where Nicodemus comes and says, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, be born again. And then this whole dialogue. And we think about this dialogue concretely as though it's like, well, of course it's, you can't be born again. And that way it's some kind of spiritual thing. But that's not what Jesus is saying at all. Jesus is literally looking at Nicodemus. You're a teacher. You're a Pharisee. You're a wise person at the heart of the institution of this faith. And yet you don't get this. He says, I got to go back into the womb again? And Jesus is like saying, of course that's not what this is about. Stop being so literal. Can you predict where the wind goes? Can you predict the Spirit? That's not what being born again is like. It's not a concrete. It's not a grasp. It's more like giving up. Do you remember this song? I'm gonna harken back. Some of you might even cringe. Some of you might even have a face of dismay and disgust when I say this. Others of you might stand up and say, let's sing it. So let me just say, do you remember this song, Trust and Obey? How many of you remember this song? Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus. Now, you're not really being very enthusiastic about this, but to trust and obey. I loved that song. When I was growing up as a young adult and I was involved in the Bill Gothard Ministries, go online, check these people out. It is scary. When I was involved with them, this was one of our favorite songs. It was one of the ways in which the men within this organization were able to also remind the women of what that meant to trust and obey. I loved it. No, you know my wife, Linda. You know I didn't love it. I had this sense, though, in which this song was so profound, mainly because the whole institution in which I was connected with, the whole structure of that evangelical sort of faith was all about rules. It was all about creeds, and not just creeds in the sense of beliefs. I don't mean that. I mean creeds in the sense of rules. Creeds in the sense of you line up along this platform or you are not a part of this group. Plus, you're probably going to hell. But besides that, you're not a part of us anymore. It was pretty strict. Now, I loved that in one sense because this idea of trust, just think of it. How do you trust in what you do not know? How do you trust in what you cannot grab? How do you trust? And for me, it was awesome because it just meant follow the rules. If you follow the rules, trusting's pretty easy. The problem with that is that after a while, it starts to fall apart. And you start to realize that that narrative doesn't hold true in all life's experiences. Following those rules to the letter don't seem to answer some of life's most difficult challenges, some of life's mysteries. And while on the one hand I tried to hold to those things as tightly as I could, what I came to realize was that at some point the only response left when it fell apart was pretty much the common response we've all heard, which is, we just don't understand the ways of God. Which is fine, except for that it ends up with me heading right back to the beginning of the song, which says, well, then I guess got to trust and obey. So it's this endless cycle. And when I read Nicodemus' story, I hear Jesus saying, you don't get it. Stop taking it so literal. It's a challenge for us, I think. Throughout all of history, the church, while it has had its great accomplishments, and while it has been at the heart of some of the most positive changes in the world, it has also been behind some of the most stringent and oppressive realities of the world, and still is in many places. Again, go check out Bill Gothard Ministries, just for a scary extreme. We get caught up in this kind of group think, and we don't realize that just how oppressive sometimes these realities get. Rules in the religious institutions like this have more to do, I think, with ecclesial control or with group fear than they have to do with faith and trust. I'm going to make a side note here, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it. I think you all are mostly with me, if not all with me. I find it utterly astounding and amazing that this past week, a whole country voted to remove all bans on same-sex marriages. I find it amazing that a country could come together in spite of its deep ecclesial roots and vote in favor of humanity. Y'all know what I'm talking about? It's my father's birthplace. My father growing up a Roman Catholic. I find it utterly amazing. Sometimes it feels as though the church has historically been a place for people to run and hide, rather than a place to embrace reality and know it. So we end up with a lot of rules, but then we also end up with a lot of contradictions. We end up with a lot of failures. Some of you have been there. You end up with a lot of shame. You end up with a lot of sense of judgment. You end up with a lot of sense of abandonment. Because ultimately, rules don't help make sense of the ups and downs and the mysteries and the tragedies and the pains of life. Ultimately, they do not. Ultimately, only relationship helps to make sense of some of these pains. Now, I think the church is great at relationships, too. I think that church is great at community. But I think this is what the paradox of what John's gospel is addressing when Jesus seems to be frustrating Nicodemus, a Pharisee. He says, I want to get this eternal life. I want this sense of being able to trust in my reality. I want this sense in which things are going to be okay. But what's curious is, for the Jews, it was their expectation of what a Messiah was supposed to be like. For us, it's our expectations of where our narratives are supposed to take us, where logically we would hope our stories would go. And in the face of catastrophes or crises or ups and downs, we can't help but want things to go our way. And so we understand God in this sort of, for lack of a better way of expressing it, a kind of supernatural slot machine where the odds are a little bit more in our favor. Now, I realize that's a harsh way to speak how we sometimes think about God, because I struggle with it too. I sometimes wonder why bad things happen to good people. I wonder why there is violence and cruelty in the world. But I think part of the problem is that we get like Nicodemus, and we think it's concrete. We think that it's a very concrete behavior, when in fact Jesus says you don't know where the wind will blow. You don't know where the Spirit is. You have to be born again. It's as if he's saying you have to unlearn and learn anew. It's as if everything we thought we knew, we have to be willing to let go in order to know again, in order to know more fully. Rachel Held Evans, she puts it this way. She says, it's a frightful thing thinking you have to get God right in order to get God to love you, thinking you're always one error away from damnation. It's kind of a legalism, really. How ironic, she says. The very condition of humanity is to be wrong about God. The moment we figure God out, God truly ceases to be God. Maybe it's time to embrace what we do not know and let ourselves off the hook. Brene Brown speaks of this as being vulnerable to life itself and then letting trust take over. So I want to think with you very quickly a couple of things about this idea of trust. I honestly have a hard time with trust. I take improv classes, you know that, because I have such a difficult time with trust. I like things to be black and white, I really do, as much as I tell myself all the time they're not. It's kind of my own practice. It's not unusual for teachers to teach what they deal with themselves, for ministers to preach what they struggle with themselves, for counselors to be open to what they're actually dealing with themselves. In the Buddhist tradition, the teacher is always the student. In this tradition with Nicodemus, I think Jesus is saying, you're a teacher, you got to let go of what you think you know. So I take improv because it forces me to let go of things. And I'm finishing up my third semester of improv. One of our other members in here, Chuck Chandler, who's not here today, he also takes this particular class over here with me at 4-day weekend. We had this wonderful example of the kind of experience it is. With improv, you are always present to the moment. You have to be open to what's happening. You can't make up your mind going into the situation, right? The scenes are made up on the moment. So we're doing two-person scenes, and this fella comes out. His name is Bin, but we all call him Vinny. He's from India, but we just all call him Vinny. And so Vinny comes out, and he's tall, and he's leaned over, and he's sawing something. And I jump up, and I step into the scene, ready to be an Irishman who's going to say, let's put that board up against the wall to patch up the hole. I've got it in my head. I jump out. He looks up, and he says, Jane, like fire I'm building. And suddenly I'm a woman with a brogue. But it wasn't where I was going. And that's part of the problem. And that's also part of the great discipline, is to just be ready to be present to whatever life offers. And it turned out to be wonderful, because now I was Jane with a brogue and trying to get away from Tarzan, who wanted to control me. And it came off really wonderfully, but the whole thing was he was going to have to go where I went, and then he's talking about my funny accent, and so but it wasn't where I intended to go at first. Improv teaches me sometimes to let go. A long time back in the mid-'80s, you want to throw this up, Austin? Can you throw this image up? Any of you guys remember this gang? I was at an old Mott's 5 and 10. It was over by a Clover Lane. Some of you might remember from Fort Worth, you might remember there used to be a Mott's 5 and 10 over there, right on Camp Bowie and Clover Lane. I had been working here as a youth director back in the 80s, and I walked in there looking for some materials for a game we were going to play one night. It was about 4:30. I stepped up to the counter, and these three guys stepped in behind me. Not exactly Larry, Darryl, and Daryl, but they looked just like them, except that each of them was brandishing a .357 Magnum. And one of them put it right up to the back of my head. Now, you would think my first thought would be pee in my pants or scream or say, please don't do something. But I looked at the cashier, who looked at the three guys and myself, and said, it's all good. I've got your money right here. How would you like it? She just began to engage them in a conversation. They moved me behind the counter, again, pointing the gun now right at my chest. Not once, for some reason, not once did I have this sense in which I was going to fall apart. In fact, it hadn't even occurred to me at that moment to offer a prayer, to say, to take deep breaths, to just panic. Nothing. There was this calm. I literally looked at the cashier as she continued to converse with them in this casual, friendly way. She said, I have this much and you can have it. And then I thought I'd be fun. I'd play along. And I said, would you like my money? I did. And I almost reached into my pocket, at which point my wife was like, well, thank God you didn't. Unless they thought you were some FBI or something and you reached for a gun. And the guy looked at me, and it was such an odd thing. He smiled back at me, and he said, no, her money, the store's money is insured and yours isn't. Who are you robbers? That reminded me of the philosophy of Larry, Daryl, and Daryl, who just seemed so oddly complacent and comfortable in their realities that you could learn something in their presence. The three of them then turned and they left with the money, and I looked at the woman and I said, oh my God, I said, I am so glad. You seem like you've done this before. And she said, I haven't, but I've kind of rehearsed it in my mind, and I've just thought this is the best way to deal with a situation like that. And she said, are you okay? Are you a doctor or something? And I said, well, no, I'm a minister. And she said, oh, well, that's why then. That's why nothing happened. God was looking over at us. And I looked at her and I went, because of me? I said, I don't think you understand or know me very well. But that's where we go to sometimes. She didn't, at that sudden moment, realize her own connection with the depth of reality itself, with the ground of being itself. Instead, at that moment, she chose to turn it over to some external divine reality. If I'd said I was a doctor, she might not even have thought of God's presence. She might have just said we were lucky, or maybe God was looking over us. It's not because I wasn't afraid, because to be honest with you, when it came time for doing the lineups, because they caught the guys a couple of days later, and when it came time for the lineups, I was so terrified I had already opted to put on a collar and shave my beard and dress myself up as an Episcopal priest so that I would blend in. As it turns out, I was the only the priest out of like 75 people who were there to do the lineup, So it's like if they ever did see somebody, they're going like, well, we know who that guy is. There is this thing about trust, which is about learning simply to be present and let go. Like floating in water. When you learn to float, you have to lean back, you have to dip your head back in the water almost up to your nose, literally, over your ears. Arms outstretched in a position of vulnerability. And you have to trust that water knows what to do. Water needs to be water. Jesus is saying spirit needs to be spirit. God needs to be God. The only way to connect deeply is to let go and to trust. I love this line from Mary Oliver. That's why I chose this. It's what I was born for. It's what we were born for. To look, to listen, to lose ourselves inside this soft world. To instruct myself over and over again. That's the challenge, I think. The challenge, I think, is to enter into every moment with a sense of openness and a sense of wonder and a willingness to learn, to not depend on something for answers other than what is already present with us, the one in whom we live and move and have our being, and to be present for one another. Because as I learned from that cashier, if God was present at all, and I do believe God was present in her. I learned to trust by watching her trust. There's an old Zen saying. I believe it was Chang Tzu who had said this once, one of the great teachers of Zen. A student had asked him, what is the meaning of Zen? And he had said, before Zen, mountains are mountains and water is water. But then I studied Zen. Mountains were no longer mountains, and water was no longer water. But then after Zen, mountains are mountains and water is water. When we open ourselves up to learning moment to moment, to letting go, we're not only literally training the neural patterns in our brain to get out of the old habits of thinking, we are literally opening ourselves up to the possibility of the ground of our being revealed to us. Amen.